The air at Oakhaven Plantation did not merely feel heavy, it felt thick, a viscous suspension of Mississippi humidity and half-forgotten sorrows. To stand on the splintering veranda was to breathe in the dust of generations, a fine, historical particulate that settled deep in the lungs. Built in the grand, ambitious antebellum style, the house had once been the pearl of the county, its whitewashed columns gleaming like the teeth of a predator. Now the facade was a study in slow, painful surrender. The fading light was literal. The ancient peeling paint was no longer white, but a sickly, mottled gray. Where the afternoon sun should have poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, it was instead fractured by grime and spiderwebs, casting long, jaundiced streaks across the parquet floor of the central hall. The very structure seemed to be subsiding, pulling the house downward as if a massive, unseen anchor had been dropped into the sodden clay beneath. The foundation bricks, laid by hands that were never truly free, were slowly crumbling, allowing the tenacious roots of the surrounding kudzu to begin their silent green invasion. Oakhaven was less a dwelling now, and more a monument to an economic and social system that had violently collapsed over a century and a half ago. Its significance was etched into every water-stained wall and every warped cypress floorboard. This was not the decay of simple neglect. It was the rot of historical guilt, manifest in timber and plaster. The wrought iron gate, half off its hinges, had once borne the proud, florid initial of the ruling family, the Blackwoods. Now it was just a rusty, melancholic obstruction, guarded by an overgrown copse of magnolias whose once fragrant blossoms had long since ceased to mask the odor of damp earth and disuse. Inside, the silence was the most profound presence. It was the silence of a packed theater after the performance has ended, a silence that seems to hold the ghost of every uttered word, every painful cry, every careless laugh. The grand staircase, designed for ladies in hoop skirts, groaned under the weight of even a gentle step, a sound that seemed less like wood friction and more like a sigh. In the library, shelves of leather-bound books stood untouched, their pages fused together by mildew, whispering of lost knowledge and suppressed truths. The property was vast, but the life had retreated entirely to the perimeter, where the forest pressed inward. Beyond the manicured circle of the main house lay the overgrown fields, the former cotton and sugarcane acreage, which now resembled a forgotten, haunted moor. Further still, hidden by a tangle of Spanish moss, were the barely discernible outlines of the original slave quarters, the small, solitary cabins whose silence was far colder and more accusatory than that of the main house. The light truly failed there, swallowed by the dense canopy. It was from these shadowy corners that the local legends claimed the haunting originated, not from the aristocratic Blackwoods, but from a deeper, older pain. The plantation was not just a house. It was a sarcophagus of the American South's troubled history, a place where the past was not merely remembered, but physically felt. Its decay was a warning. It waited for the current visitor, the skeptic, Dr. Alastair, to step across the threshold and learn that in places like Oakhaven, the light never truly dies. It simply transforms into a different, darker kind of perpetual twilight. The history here was alive, and it was demanding to be solved. Dr. Elias Alastair, the historian and self-proclaimed skeptic, tried to attribute the sound to the house's decrepitude. It was a faint, rhythmic thump, tap, thump, too regular to be the wind playing tricks on a loose shutter, and too soft to be a rat in the walls. It emanated not from the grand house, but from the fields beyond, where the long-dead rows of cotton had surrendered. These letters painted a grim picture of the immediate post-Civil War era. They were addressed to Colonel Blackwood, who had returned from the war not as a hero, but as a broken man to a crumbling empire. The letters were desperate pleas for credit, furious legal notices about unpaid taxes, and, most damningly, frantic exchanges with a neighboring landowner about the problem of the newly freed laborers. The prevailing mood was one of bitter, bewildered resentment, a deep, poisonous entitlement robbed of its foundation. The inherited shadow was not merely economic, it was intensely personal and emotional. The ghost stories Alistair had dismissed as folklore now began to align terrifyingly with the historical record. The colonel, stripped of his power, had clung fiercely to the one thing he felt he still owned, the land. One letter, penned in a shaking hand by the colonel's distraught wife, detailed the disappearance of a former house servant named Eliza. He swore she stole the silver, though I saw no sign of it. He took to the fields with the old cane and the dogs, and she has not been seen since Tuesday. I fear the worst, Elias. The law means nothing to him now. Only his pride remains. We are haunted by the consequences of his temper. This single passage provided a plausible, tragic human dimension to the tappers and the weeping Alistair had heard. The emotional weight of 65 was the shift from outright ownership to violent, desperate control. The colonel, unable to comprehend the change in society, had acted on his old, brutal instincts, creating a permanent trauma on the land. Alistair realized the lingering emotional weight was why the haunting felt so intense and so historically specific. It wasn't the ghost of a happy memory, it was the psychic residue of a crime committed in the chaos of a collapsing world. The faint, rhythmic thump, tap, thump was not just the sound of spectral labor. It was the drumbeat of the colonel's relentless search for the missing servant, Eliza, and perhaps the sound of the violent encounter that followed. That night, Alistair experienced the house's power firsthand. He awoke to the sound of heavy boots pacing the hall outside his room, the cadence slow, deliberate, and radiating cold fury. The sound paused right outside his door, and he felt a palpable drop in temperature, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He did not hear a whisper. He heard a low, throaty, commanding cough, the sound of a man accustomed to having his orders instantly obeyed. It was the colonel, the angry, defeated master, whose authority had been shattered in 1865, but whose malevolence still reigned within the walls of Oakhaven, searching for his lost property and demanding that the world and history return to its former order. The shadow of 65 was a presence of pure, unyielding resentment. Dr. Elias Alistair, a historian specializing in postbellum Southern economics, considered himself a man of quantifiable truths. His world was bound by archival evidence, dated receipts, and verifiable primary sources. Ghosts, specters, and weeping field hands belonged firmly in the realm of folklore. Charming, perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant distractions from the serious work of academic history. His initial viewpoint on Oakhaven, even after the faint smells and the rhythmic tapping, was one of staunch, unwavering skepticism. His arrival had been less a search for the supernatural and more a mission to reconstruct the financial collapse of the Blackwood family. He saw the house's decay not as a sign of spiritual corruption, but as a classic case study in poor property management and agricultural debt following the Emancipation Proclamation. The heavy silence, the broken glass, the thick air, it was all atmosphere, useful for a Gothic novel, but meaningless to a researcher dedicated to the facts. Superstition, he'd muttered, typing notes into his ruggedized laptop, a decidedly modern intrusion into the 19th century gloom. He logged the faint sounds as acoustic anomaly, possibly. His fingers stopped halfway through the ledger, at a name he recognized from Mrs. Blackwood's distraught letter, Eliza. The entry for Eliza was detailed: house servant, seamstress, age 19,
Value, $1,500. Skilled work. Purchased, 1860, Mobile. But it was the final annotation, written in Colonel Blackwood's recognizable, scratchy hand, that sent a chill far colder than any localized drop in temperature. It was dated November 1865, shortly after the war's formal end, and written entirely in Latin, a weak attempt to cloak the violence with academic dignity. Discuss it, res non inventa, terram non relincet, nomen ites delatum est. Alastair translated the final line. She departed. The thing, silver, not found. She will not leave the land. Her name is erased. The ambiguity of discessit, she departed, was instantly contradicted by the chilling final sentence, she will not leave the land. This wasn't a record of someone running away to freedom, it was a declaration of permanent, forced internment. The ledger was not just a historical document, it was a cryptographic key to the hauntings. The whispers of the cotton fields, the sound of the tappers, the heartbreaking weeping, they all coalesced around the identity of Eliza. The colonel hadn't just murdered a servant, he had condemned her, both in life and in the historical record, to perpetual bondage on the very soil she had toiled on. Alastair looked up from the table, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light, and for the first time his skepticism faltered. The cold fury he had sensed the night before, the colonel's presence, was directly linked to the man's final violent act of control recorded in the ledger. The ghost was not a vague generalized spirit, it was Eliza, bound by the injustice and the powerful written command of her former owner. The historian realized his task had changed. He wasn't simply solving an economic puzzle, he was locating the site of a forgotten systemic crime and providing the one thing Eliza had been brutally denied, her name, her story, and the freedom to leave the land. He held the ghost's identity in his hands. The discovery of the Ledger of the Lost had irrevocably shifted Dr. Alastair's perspective. The academic curiosity that had been his shield against the supernatural was now breached by a profound sense of historical responsibility. He no longer sought to debunk the ghosts, but to understand the specific, human tragedy they represented. Armed with Eliza's name and the colonel's chilling Latin inscription, he walked into Oakhaven's decaying ballroom, a room he had previously avoided. The ballroom was a testament to faded grandeur. Its once gleaming floor was now a mosaic of peeling varnish and warped wood. Massive, dust-shrouded chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their crystals long since plundered or shattered. Dominating one wall was an enormous, ornate ballroom mirror, its silvered surface dulled by age, framed by a gilded border that had lost much of its luster. It was a portal to a bygone era, reflecting only a distorted, sepia-toned version of the present. Alastair set up his tripod, his thermal camera, and a sensitive audio recorder. He wasn't looking for a ghost in the sensational sense, but for evidence of Eliza's presence, a lingering energy tied to the injustice he had uncovered. He stood before the mirror, its surface showing him a tired, scholarly man amidst the ruin, and spoke aloud, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. "Eliza, my name is Elias Alastair,"
provided a pretext for his pursuit and the final murderous act recorded in the ledger. She will not leave the land. The unpaid debt was the life stolen from Eliza, but more acutely, it was the denial of her freedom. She died not as a slave, but as a free woman violently murdered for daring to claim her liberty. Her spirit was not tethered by chains, but by the colonel's powerful, final command, a dark echo of ownership that still held sway over the land. In the storage room, Alastair found what Eliza's spectral hand had pointed toward, a heavy, wooden chest, too large to be moved easily, shoved against the stone wall. He used a crowbar he'd brought for the archives, and with a terrible splintering sound, forced the lid open. Inside, beneath layers of musty canvas, lay a jumble of tarnished goods, candelabras, tea sets, and various pieces of silverware, the very silver Eliza was accused of stealing. But wrapped in a linen handkerchief beneath the silver was the tragic clue: a small, handmade wooden doll and a tightly folded, water-damaged piece of paper. The paper was a freedom certificate issued by the Union Provost Marshal, dated 3 months before Eliza's death. It was officially signed and stamped, granting Eliza, formerly of Oakhaven, her unconditional liberty. Alistair looked from the paper to the silver that had supposedly been stolen. The evidence was clear. Eliza hadn't stolen the silver. She had been preparing to leave, taking only a treasured possession, the doll, and her certificate of freedom. The colonel, finding the silver packed away, had twisted the evidence into a charge of theft to justify his rage and subsequent violence. The curse was the colonel's lie, cemented by his power, that had robbed Eliza of her future. Her spirit was bound by the injustice of being accused of theft when she was merely claiming what was legally and morally hers. She was waiting for someone to find the proof and clear her name, an act that would finally pay the debt owed to her soul. The discovery of Eliza's freedom certificate and the actual silver in the storage room transformed the stolen property from a historical charge into a key clue. Dr. Alistair, his academic mind now fully engaged in the detective work of the spectral, realized the silver's presence was central to the colonel's narrative of justification. He hadn't just used the accusation to mask a murder. He had used the physical presence of the packed silver to confirm his lie to the few people left at Oakhaven. Alistair began meticulously examining the contents of the wooden chest. Amidst the tarnished forks and sugar tongues, he found one particularly heavy, large ladle, a ceremonial piece used for serving punch. Unlike the other pieces, this ladle bore a very deep, distinct indentation near the bowl, an ugly, localized dent that was clearly not a result of time or simple use. He turned the ladle over in his gloved hands, remembering the local lore Mrs. May had mentioned. The colonel was known to carry a heavy, silver-tipped cane, particularly after his injury during the war. Alistair's heart started to pound with the realization. This specific historical artifact, the ladle, was not just a piece of property. It was likely an instrument of violence, or at least a silent witness to it. The dent was sharp, too deliberate to be accidental. It matched the sort of heavy, concentrated blow delivered by a cane or a similar bludgeon. Alistair placed the silver ladle back into the chest, noticing that the lining beneath the punch set was heavily stained. Not stained with mold, but with a dark, reddish-brown residue that seemed to have penetrated the wood itself. He pulled the chest away from the wall, revealing the stone foundation behind it. The stones here were different from the main house, rougher, less finished. He ran his hand over the damp surface, feeling the cold seep into his fingers. The moment he touched the stones, the faint scent of cotton and
The entries revealed a young woman of resilience and hope. She wrote of her forbidden literacy, taught in secret by Mrs. Blackwood's younger sister, her quiet joy in sewing for the family, and increasingly after 1864, her fervent dreams of freedom. The last entry, dated November 16, 1865, the day before the colonel's Latin inscription, was the most heartrending. The paper is mine,
and the light of freedom is bright. I have packed the few things I hold dear, the doll for my niece and the small silver pieces I mended for Mrs. B. Tomorrow, I will walk past the cotton fields one last time. I will leave the land, and the great silence will be mine. The Lord is with me. But the entry was violently interrupted. A large, dark ink smear blotted the last sentence, and beneath it, written in a shaky, clearly panicked hand, were only 3 words. The secret is the well. The hidden discovery was complete. The diary gave Eliza back her voice, shattering the Colonel's lie forever. The stolen silver was merely mended, packed for safekeeping before her departure. The terrible final clue, the secret is the well, immediately tied back to the cross-carving Alistair had found by the storage room. The storage room was near the old, dry well shaft used for rinsing laundry. The Colonel hadn't merely buried her nearby. In a final act of desecration and concealment, he had forced her body into the abandoned well, using the silver chest and perhaps the very ladle that bore the dent to cover the entrance or mark the spot. The place where the life-giving water had once been was now the tomb for her stolen life. Alistair looked at the fireplace, now seeing it not as a source of warmth, but as the hidden archive where Eliza had stored her truth, awaiting the historian who would finally listen. The diary's final desperate clue, the secret is the well, drove Dr. Alistair out into the moonless, oppressive night. He had located the approximate site of the old, unused well shaft near the laundry room, close to where he had found the crude cross carved into the stone wall. The air here was heavy, humming with the concentrated, psychic energy of the house's darkest secret. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was different. Above, the sky was starless, but a peculiar, ominous light tinged the clouds. The night of the red moon, a rare astronomical event that seemed to saturate the historical landscape with a blood-red haze. Alistair knew this was his chance. The sheer emotional power of the scene, coupled with the astronomical anomaly, felt like a thinning of the barrier between the present and the past, a veil ready to be pierced. He set his camera and recorders, but this time he wasn't documenting, he was bearing witness. He stood beside the shallow stone-lined lip of the dry well, which was mostly obscured by thorny bushes and decades of debris. He spoke Eliza's name aloud, not as a historian, but as an accuser, challenging the silence. Suddenly, the red moonlight seemed to focus like a spotlight on the well. The sounds of the present, the crickets, the wind, vanished, replaced by the chaotic sounds of 1865. Alistair felt a fierce, icy pressure shove him backward, and as he stumbled, he witnessed the historical flashback. The veil tore. He saw the scene not as a hazy apparition, but as a fully realized 3-dimensional projection of the past. It was Colonel Blackwood, his face contorted with rage and sweat, dressed in tattered remnants of his uniform, the silver-tipped cane held high. The sight of him was visceral, the embodiment of the resentful master stripped from his power.
Searching through the remnants of the Colonel's personal papers, now knowing exactly what kind of crime he was looking for, Alistair found it, tucked inside a hollowed-out base of an inkwell on the Colonel's desk. It was a single, folded piece of thick, official county letterhead, signed by Sheriff Kincaid himself, but marked void and heavily underlined. This was the sheriff's unsent testimony. The document was an affidavit, meticulously detailing the disappearance of Eliza. It confirmed the discovery of the hidden silver and the Colonel's subsequent search, but the critical paragraphs were where Kincaid admitted what happened after. Quote, Colonel Blackwood presented me with a gift for services rendered to the county militia. Said gift was sufficient to quiet the worries regarding the servant's absence. I was informed the woman, Eliza, had simply fled north, having taken the silver. The matter was closed on my authority. However, I have lately been afflicted by dreams and know the Colonel's account to be a lie. I suspect, before God, that the Colonel murdered the woman and sealed her in the ground on his property. I dare not send this. My life and that of my family depends upon the lie." This was devastating. The historical figure's involvement revealed that the murder was an open secret within the local power structure. Sheriff Kincaid, struggling with his conscience, had written down the truth, but his fear of the powerful Colonel Blackwood, even a defeated colonel, had been stronger than his duty. He avoided his own testimony, choosing personal safety over justice, thus ensuring the crime would remain officially unsolved. The ghost wasn't just bound by the Colonel's decree, she was trapped by the failure of the justice system in the post-war South. Alistair held the proof of a systemic cover-up, the final, crucial link connecting the historical injustice to the enduring paranormal presence. He now had the full story: the crime, the criminal, the victim, the motivation, and the institutional failure that had solidified the curse. The discovery of Sheriff Kincaid's unsent testimony eliminated all doubt. Dr. Alistair's historical investigation had culminated in irrefutable proof of murder and cover-up. Now the final task was not scholarly, but moral. A reckoning. The burden of the past could only be lifted through acknowledgement from the present. He arranged a meeting with Miss Eleanor Blackwood, the Colonel's great-great-granddaughter, and the last living owner of Oakhaven. She was a polite, elderly woman who lived in a small, modern apartment in New Orleans, rarely visiting the crumbling plantation, which she saw only as a financial liability and a dusty monument to a family history she preferred to ignore. Alistair met her in a quiet coffee shop, far removed from the oppressive shadows of Oakhaven. He laid out the evidence with meticulous care: the pages from the Ledger of the Lost, the diary extracts containing Eliza's final words, the water-stained freedom certificate, and finally, the damning, voided testimony of Sheriff Kincaid. Eleanor, initially defensive and brittle, stared at the documents. She had grown up with the vague, sanitized narrative of the Blackwoods, a family that had suffered economic hardship after the war, who were misunderstood, and whose land was rumored to be unlucky. She had learned to dismiss the ghost stories as local gossip. "We all know the South has its dark past, Doctor," she said, her voice tight. "But Oakhaven was a plantation. Terrible things happened. Why do you insist on digging up one instance?" Alistair looked her straight in the eye, his voice low but firm. "Because this isn't just about a dark past, Miss Eleanor. It's about Eliza, a young woman who had earned her freedom only to be murdered by your ancestor, Colonel Blackwood, who then lied about it, sealed her body in an old well, and used his wealth to buy the silence of the law. Your family's wealth was literally founded upon and sustained by this crime.
Alistair looked at the remains, feeling a profound sense of closure mixed with deep sadness. He wasn't just finding bones. He was validating a life, a brutal end, and a century of haunting. The specific task to resolve the injustice was not a prayer, but a declaration. Before the small gathering, Alistair read aloud Eliza's freedom certificate, proclaiming her legal liberty to the cold, witnessing air. Then, Eleanor Blackwood stepped forward, clutching the cotton-covered diary. "Eliza," Eleanor said, her voice breaking the heavy silence, "my family was wrong. My ancestor committed a grievous crime. We acknowledge the truth. We acknowledge your freedom. You were never property. You were a free woman who was murdered. Your name is clear." She placed the diary and a fresh white magnolia blossom, a symbol of the South now representing purity and dignity, beside the well. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The crushing cold lifted, replaced by a sudden rush of warm, clean air. The oppressive silence that had defined Oakhaven vanished, replaced by the natural sounds of the afternoon, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves outside. The overwhelming feeling of sorrow and resentment that had clung to the air was gone. The tappers were silent because their vigil was over. The curse was lifted because the truth had been spoken by the very line of the oppressor. That evening, as the sun finally set over Oakhaven, casting long, peaceful shadows, Alistair saw a final glimpse in the twilight. Not the angry, spectral figure of the colonel, nor the mournful, sorrowful form of Eliza, but a faint, gentle shimmer of light rising from the well shaft and drifting upward, finally free of the land. The ghost was gone. The historical debt had been paid. The moment the earth closed back over the remnants of the well shaft, marked now by a simple, newly placed marble stone bearing the inscription, Eliza, free, departed November 16th, 1865, the change in Oakhaven was palpable. The decades of accumulated psychic weight seemed to dissolve instantly. It was as if the plantation, which had suffered from a long chronic fever, had finally broken. The immediate aftermath was characterized by an almost unnerving lightness. The air inside the house no longer felt thick and hostile. It felt merely old, scented with dust and magnolia, but stripped of its oppressive coldness. The oppressive silence that had been the signature of the haunting was replaced by the natural sounds of a neglected old house, the creaking of timber in the cooling air, the faint hum of insects, and the rustling of leaves outside. For the first time, Dr. Alistair felt he could breathe deeply within Oakhaven's walls without inhaling the phantom scent of sweat and cotton. He walked through the house, observing the transformation. The ballroom mirror, once a site of chilling manifestation, now reflected only the empty, sun-dusted room, a dull piece of furniture, nothing more. The infamous red stain on the hearth, which he had always suspected was blood, but dismissed as mold, now appeared to simply be soot and rust. The house had shed its terror. The tragedy remained in the historical record, but the curse was gone. Eleanor Blackwood, having committed to the truth, was now energized by the sense of resolution. She did not try to sell the house or whitewash the past. Instead, she announced plans to turn Oakhaven into a historical site dedicated to the truth, renaming the property the Eliza House Museum of Historical Reckoning. The house will no longer be a monument to my family's pride or their crimes, she told Alistair, her voice steady. It will be a monument to Eliza's resilience and the history that should never be forgotten. It must stand as a reminder that the denial of freedom is the ultimate injustice. The most profound shift was auditory. The rhythmic thump tap of the tappers from the fields never returned. The sounds of heavy, angry pacing were silenced. The house, which had been performing the agonizing soundtrack of 1865, had fallen quiet. The house breathes again, a slow, steady, quiet inhalation of peace. Alistair packed his bags, his skepticism replaced by a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of history and human trauma. He carried with him the copies of the ledgers and testimonies